everybody. Thank you for joining us for the 19th Annual Chicago Humanities Festival, this year themed Thinking Big. I'm Robert Cole, Chairman of the Board of Directors of Center on Halsted, the community center for the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community here in Chicago. Center on Halsted is very pleased to be the co-sponsor of this first queer program at the Chicago Humanities Festival, and the program today is titled Queer Lyrics. Just a little commercial. For more information about the Center on Halsted, please feel free to check out our website, www.centeronhalsted.org. That's all one word, Center on Halsted. Or come and visit us. The center is located at Halsted and Waveland. Please join me in thanking the Poetry Foundation for its generous sponsorship of this program. And let's also recognize the members of the Humanities Festival's Charter Humanist Circle for their significant support of the festival. I'd also like to thank the Harold Washington Library for hosting us today. This afternoon, the Humanities Festival welcomes 3 talented and dynamic gay and lesbian artists for a discussion of how writers grapple with big questions of social, political, and cultural resonance surrounding the LGBT experience. Our moderator today is Cece Carter. Cece is a writer, poet, performer, and cultural impresario. Cece has developed myriad cultural programs throughout the city, including at Center on Halsted, where she has served as the Director of Community and Cultural Programs. Cece received a Lambda Literary Award nomination for her poetry and won the Lambda Book Review's annual National Slam competition, among many local and national slam victories. Cece teaches performance poetry workshops at Columbia College in Chicago. The festival is also honored to welcome award-winning poet Mark Doty. Mark's 6 books of poems have received numerous honors, such as T.S. Eliot Prize, National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Award. Mark has also received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations. Mark teaches in the graduate program at the University of Houston. Finally, please join me in welcoming Achy Obejas, a much-honored journalist, novelist, and poet. Chicago Tribune readers, including myself, enjoyed Achy's coverage of arts and culture for 10 years, and her writing received a Pulitzer Prize and the Studs Terkel Journalism Prize. Achy is also a 2-time Lambda Literary Award winner and recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Poetry. She's currently the Sor Juana visiting writer at DePaul University here in Chicago. So let's welcome our panelists for Queer Lyrics.
So we want to thank Robert Cole from the Center on Halsted, and I think we'll just start. I just wanted to give you a synopsis of where we're going to start within the careers of these fabulous, fabulous writers, and hopefully those who are not familiar with their work will be able to see in context about where their work and some of the work that they'll be reading from today, where it fit and why it was such a big thing. And particularly, I will say that because I am very honored to be on the stage with them, having been a recipient of some of their work in terms of in class studying their work, and that what that meant to me as a closeted at the time young lesbian reading work that all of a sudden began to proliferate colleges and campuses and was no longer just isolated within an LGBT construct, which many of us know there weren't many LGBT departments of study back in the 80s, as I'll date myself. And so what I did was I kind of said, let's talk about where we, all 3 of us, begin to intersect within each other's lives. Me being able to study their work, and then where they intersect together, where their work kind of crosses, which is why it became so huge to be this big idea. For one, it was the 90s. And there was a huge LGBT movement of political art emerging within the country around AIDS, around also there was a resurgence of what we called from the I generation to the me generation, which was multiculturalism, hit hugely. And as a teacher at that time, teaching English to junior high school students, it was very interesting, all the anthologies that started coming out. And then I was also trying to get my master's at the time. So I'm teaching and then I'm studying at the same time. And so multicultural education was the buzz in the 90s, and it became codified as the me generation of work, which is multicultural education, or what we termed multicultural examination of self. So enter the two people where the work begins to intersect around political art, around the AIDS movement, and around multicultural issues. What this did to the literary community and what it did for art and activism was completely huge in the sense, and it was big. And it was bigger than the fact that it was actually put on paper and in books. It was bigger than the fact that it was isolated. It was no longer isolated to a particular department. So whereas before I could only study poets in a poetry department, if I was studying a poetry class, and I could only study Latina or Hispanic culture in a women's studies department or in a world department or in a fiction class. What was going on was that you could no longer isolate these particular artists in one area or pigeonhole them. So I learned about Mark Doty in my history class, because it was a specific segment talking about what was going on globally around AIDS and the AIDS issue. And so I was not introduced to him in a poetry class. I learned about Achy not from a women's studies class and not from a fiction class, but a global lit class. And so therefore, what happened is their work was able to transcend. And not only that, you could not just study them, but you then had to bring up the issue of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer issues, which no longer was relegated to a department of LGBT studies. And so in and of themselves, either one of them could be a topic among themselves to actually talk about what was big, about why their work was so important. But to bring them together today in the fact that their work also transcends anything in terms of being marginalized into just a literary genre. It was very important during that time. So, with that said, I would like to ask a question. You all came about, we were all intersected within each other around the 90s. And I know for a fact Alexandria, and then also we came all the way from Cuba to dress like this. We're in the 90s, as well as Memory Mambo. So what was a big influence that informed your writing during that time, and why?
I guess it's my turn to answer.
Yeah.
Well, first, let me say I'm happy to be in Chicago, and it's delightfully confusing to be in a city where many men walk through town wearing the word bears on themselves. Didn't quite know what to do with that. And I'm really struck by what you're saying, Cece, about the text that you study in school. I mean, as a person who went to college in the 70s, my experience was, of course, radically different. Mm-hmm. And we were certainly reading gay and lesbian writers as just simply that sexuality was not part of the conversation. Exactly. We somehow managed to talk about Song of Myself at some length without ever talking about Whitman's the obvious delight in same-sex desire that poem espouses. how do we do that? And now it seems to me a complete mystery. And so with that in mind, it's thrilling to me to think about my own work being part of a conversation which might open doors for younger writers. And in my teaching now, I work primarily with graduate writers, many of whom are younger gay men and lesbians who have grown up talking about other gay and lesbian writers with sexuality being part of the conversation, so that they have many kinds of lenses for reading and considering the works in front of them. That is an extraordinary kind of expansion of the possibilities of thinking that was not possible when I was in school. And that kind of thinking then enables people to live differently and to write differently without going through, I hope, the same kind of agonizing process of finding permission to speak that might have been the case for writers of my generation. So it's wonderful. To answer your question, the answer is threat for me. Feeling pushed as an artist by being endangered. And that danger comes first from the simple condition in which we continue to live, which is living in a homophobic culture where we're simply not safe. And becoming, as I became more visible, as I was coupled early in the 90s, understanding that we were in some way embattled, and then beginning to see around us the increasing devastation of the crisis years of the epidemic, and having the sense that there were some very important things to be done. One was simply to represent what it was like to be living in dread, that I couldn't find that spoken for me anywhere. And I had grown up, as I think most Americans had at that point, having a kind of faith in medical technology. If there was something wrong with us, something would come along to help us out. When I was a first grader, I stood in line to get my Salk polio vaccine on that little sugar cube, and that was a sign that whatever's out there can be treated, that there's a way to approach this. Well, the AIDS epidemic comes along and there's absolutely nothing. And we had seen the devastation of the late 80s, and in the 90s it simply continued to get worse. There was no sense until the appearance of new medication in 1995, seemingly out of the blue, that there was even hope on the horizon. So you have the years of the early 90s that were murderous. I lived at that time in Provincetown, Massachusetts, a town of about 3,000 people, a year-round community. We averaged, during the first 5 years of the 90s, a funeral a week. Okay, so if you live in a town that tiny and people are dying at that rate, there is such an internal pressure to speak back in some way. And there was, of course, also the fact that the mainstream narrative of the epidemic was nothing like what I saw in front of me. You saw images of suffering and abandonment, of degradation. Those things were true, but I was also seeing generosity, compassion, phenomenal strength in the community, organizing people to help other people. And I just didn't see that on TV, and I didn't read it in the newspaper. And to carry the stories of the community to whatever degree a poem can do that, a piece of nonfiction can do that, felt to me absolutely crucial. There's not a whole lot we can do for the dead, but we can remember them, and we can give shape to what we remember. So to be able to try to inscribe that seemed to me absolutely imperative.
Wonderful. Achy?
Well, first I also want to just thank everybody for coming here and being with us today. I was in school also in the 70s, and my experience was different from yours, but it was also different from yours because I was going to school in Bloomington, Indiana, and it was just about the time when women's studies was sort of really getting off the ground on that campus. So there was a whole lot of conversation about feminist issues, and within that, there was actually a very supportive place for lesbian writing and talking about literature in a way that did, in fact, bring in the issue of sexuality. In fact, for me, what was kind of interesting about the 90s was that just prior to that, I felt like my life had been pretty separated. Things were not integrated at all. You know, there was the me that hung out with gay men and was a total fag hag. Yeah, I can do the Supremes. And then there was the me that was a lesbian, who was hanging out with lesbian separatists. Remember them? You know, went to Michigan and, you know, did security.
Yes.
And then there was the me who was Cuban, not Latina, very specifically Cuban, and who had this very strong identification around the island and around nationality. And one of the things that for me was important in the 90s was that those things sort of collapsed on each other, because it was no longer possible to have a lesbian separatist narrative that didn't bring in, I mean, not that I was a lesbian separatist, but God knows I was surrounded by them. I don't know what my problem was. I could go 6 months without seeing a man other than in a toll booth. So, I kid you not.
Yes. And you still
But but it was no longer possible to have that narrative and not, you know, understand that, you know, how absolutely inhumane that was, given what was happening to the men around us. And in my case, it was happening to men who were friends and who were dear to me and who I loved. So there was a coming together in the community that really had no precedent, I think, from the 60s on, you know, because I think as women found themselves as women, one of the things that happened with lesbians is that they took up a different path from men, and they were questioning privilege in a way that men were not questioning. In fact, I think it took AIDS for men to question privilege. You know, I frequently used to think that a lot of the political discourse around gay men had to do with not really finding the world all that terrible, just in this one way. You know, because they were white men, they were middle class, they were this, and then the rest of us were questioning things at a much more fundamental level. And then when AIDS came along, that changed. You know, gay men really became radicalized in a way that I at least had not seen. And I had hung out with a lot of gay men and a lot of political men, but it just hadn't happened quite the way AIDS did. I mean, AIDS had gay men questioning the medical establishment, the political system, all sorts of, and suddenly we were also talking about race in a different way, because AIDS made the case that you couldn't really separate from anybody else. And suddenly, I mean, I remember, you know, working with the Mayor's Commission on Gay and Lesbian Issues. Everybody else, by the way, was, you know, the Mayor's Commission on blah, blah, blah affairs, but they couldn't do that. Yeah, I'm not making that up. It was Latino affairs, gay and lesbian issues. And having, you know, suddenly everybody in the room be, you know, white, and we have to do outreach to, you know, the black community, we have to do outreach to the Latino community, and suddenly a lot of the racism that had been, you know, galloping in the gay and lesbian community, because the gay and lesbian community was white and middle class for the most part as far as what it projected, was suddenly, you know, sort of forced to contend with that and deal with that in a different way. And for me, I was living in Chicago, and in terms of Latino stuff, because of that also sort of integrated that aspect of my life. And I had also had to suddenly live in a place where, you know, there were Puerto Ricans, there were Mexicans, there were Guatemalans in a way that I hadn't experienced. I mean, my experience growing up Latino was in Michigan City, Indiana. You know that's not good. And it wasn't, you know, it was a small community, and, you know, my parents were teachers, so we were sort of privileged within that small Latino community. And then, of course, in the summers, we would, you know, like lemmings, you know, return to Miami, which is not really a part of the United States. And,
right.
But in the 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and it also caused havoc in Cuba. And it forced a different conversation about Cuba and about the future of Cuba. So my entire life was, you know, all aspects of my identity were in flux and being challenged. So for me, it was an era of tremendous possibility and tremendous pain and tremendous, you know, questioning. And so that's what I ended up writing about, because I find writing to be a process of discovery, a process by which I work things out. So I was not only writing books, I was writing a lot for Windy City Times and writing for The Reader and writing for, the LA Times and the occasional Tribune story. It was slightly insane to be writing one day for the Republican newspaper, the next day for Windy City Times, the next day for La Raza. So it was, the good thing was that all the issues were playing out in all of those places. For me, it was a time of tremendous integration.
And that's very interesting because for me, it was that discovery that there were gay people other than me. That the whole issue around being closeted at the time and being in an all-girls school at Spelman and all African-American, all-girls Christian school kind of thing, and then walking past and seeing what was big for me was that, Black people weren't gay or lesbian, right? And because we were watching the news and we were constantly seeing, and I know that there were friends of mine that were being affected, and but it was very hush-hush and hush-hush. And then to see in the school bookstore Cheryl Clark's book of poetry, Living as a Lesbian. And I literally went around the corner, kept walking past, wouldn't go in the bookstore until I knew nobody was going in the bookstore, and literally waited till the last person was out of the door, grabbed the book, and said, oh my God, this is what's wrong. No, this is what's right with me, right? So that was my big moment, and then from there began to find you all in other kinds of spaces and places and departments, which was very much a relief for someone, for me. So I think that is really good. I want to go to the next question, which is the fact that we talk about, both of you all use or make reference to memory a lot in your work. Either the use of memory as a tactic for writing, as a way to convey message, as a way to engage a reader, or either you actually use the word memory often in your work. So I want to know how important and why is that so important in your work, and particularly around the issues of exile and isolation and loss.
Well, two great gay male writers of the 20th century, two of all our predecessors, Marcel Proust and Constantine Cavafy, are the patron saints of memory. That they are artists who construct, in Proust's case, this vast architecture of memory, and in Cavafy's case, these beautiful little jewel box poems that are very contained like little rooms which open onto remembered scenes. It's no accident that they are both men who couldn't exactly connect with a lover, set up housekeeping, and remain together. Because the kind of sexual life available to them was one of the glancing encounter, too much social pressure, an impossibility to make the kind of bond between equals that we've been working to forge. So what do you have if you can't keep love? You have memory. And so you build what you can to retain what can be cherished. I guess similarly in the light of the crisis years of the epidemic, that writing is a way to make some kind of hedge against loss. And I love what Achy was saying about discovery, that we write to discover, and we also write to bear witness, yes? But we don't know what we've witnessed often until we write it, right?
Right.
To write, it can be an act of discovering what I have seen and what I have known. So there's a way.
It's important.
Yeah, and I think it's probably true for lots of writers that I think we often feel like our lives aren't entirely real to us until we've written them. It's the act of writing that allows you to live more deeply into your own experience. And so in that way, writing is always remembering in a large sense of what remembering might mean.
For me, it has to do with history a lot, this notion of memory. The idea that somebody else is always writing our history. And so I think because I'm Cuban and because the United States has this very particular way of looking at events in Cuba, like, you know, the Cuban War of Independence has been completely hijacked by American history books. It's the Spanish-American War. You guys don't even know we're in our own fucking independence war when you read about it. This notion, I mean, of history always sort of being skewed to the victor or to, you know, the oppressor, for, you know, lack of a better word, that it's really important to sort of add a different perspective. You know, not that I think that there's any way that, I don't think there's any one truth to anything, but I do think it's important to sort of keep adding different perspectives to the mix to say, well, okay, that's how you remember it, but I remember it this way. And, you know, it was, you know, from this perspective, it looked like this. And that may be true, but so is this. And I think gay and lesbian people are kind of a colonized people and have been historically, and it's important to sort of, you know, speak to that power and say that's not exactly how it is. This is how it is, at least how I live it and how I am. It's funny because I'm having this like weird Facebook conversation right now with my French teacher for seventh grade, who I used to have a mad crush on, and who is a Messianic Jew. Kill me now. And so suddenly I'm having this very sort of, frankly, elementary conversation about, you know, who we are as gay people, you know. And I mean, she actually throws things out to me like, I just don't see how bodies work that way. You know, I don't know what to do with that, you know. I end up saying things like, you know, my love is as pure as any. You know, it's this constant conversation of talking back to ignorance, talking back to power, sort of, you know, important to set the record straight. I don't know if that's the right word, God, no. But sort of just keep adding to the mix, I guess, and saying there's another way to think, there's another way, there's another perspective.
And that becomes really important in the sense that it almost becomes an autobiographical of a people, of a person, of a time in which we live, and how someone can reference back. So memory, I thought, was a really, really nice intersection between the two of you all and the work that you did, and because it was always a connection back to some period even past the 90s that you reference and come back to, or a historical reference that comes back in play in the reading, and how it engaged me as a reader. So let's go to where art and activism work. So we know about the 60s, and I know my parents taught me about the 60s works, and I grew up reading, you know, Nikki Giovanni and all of the different poets that came around, the beat poets and those kind of poets before, and as art being this catalyst for activism. And then in the 90s, both of you all's work have been used as a way to really uplift what was going on in the times. Where do you think your work and what is the role of an artist or a writer now in this particular political climate, and issues around war and issues around global issues and national and local issues, and particularly an LGBT artist?
Well, I would go back to, you know, what you were saying about that sense of collective memory. And one of the real pleasures of any work of art for the reader is that when you have that moment of saying, this person has spoken something that I felt, or, oh, I recognize that. And it seems to me that art keeps doing that. That's why, you know, Ezra Pound called it the news that stays news, right? That poetry, prose keeps giving us that sense of what it is to be human in any particular moment. I'm not much interested in trying to give a message, because I don't think that people are persuaded by poems, exactly, or persuaded even by fiction or by memoirs. But I think that what we love to find is the reflection of how it feels to be alive in this moment. And what can be more powerful than that? So we feel less alone. We feel provoked to look more deeply at our own lives. And, we don't need the specifics of, say, an AIDS crisis to make us do that. We are surrounded by so many kinds of difficulties at this moment that I think it's hard for us to remain conscious of them, right? Our human situation is so terrifying at this moment in history that one of the things that art needs to do is to just help us stay awake to what would otherwise overwhelm us. And I would hope to in some way encourage us. There's a beautiful line from the Palestinian poet Taha Muhammad Ali. He says a startling thing, which is this. He says, art is worthless unless it plants a measure of splendor in men and women's hearts. Now, he says a measure of splendor. That might be a drop. Right. That might be a wish that things were different, or the hope that we could in some way change things. But I do believe that art at its best gives us some reason to take heart, to continue, to keep trying.
Ditto.
Okay. Well, with that, we will open it up because we want to make sure that we get to hear from them. So are you ready to hear some of their work? Yes. So in any particular order?
Okay.
Mark will go first.
I'm going to go first. She's next. Okay. This is a poem. I want to try to dispel. I can't dispel all our dread and tension about Tuesday, right? I think we're all living like this, okay? But this is intended to be a little blast of joy. Just give us a break for a second. We are in a Latin bar in San Francisco. The name of the bar, Esta Noche, Spanish for tonight, is also the title of the poem. Esta Noche. In a dress with a black tulip's sheen, La fabulosa Lola enters late, mounts the stairs to the plywood platform, and begs whoever runs the wobbling spot to turn the lights down to something flattering. When they halo her with a petal-tone gel, she sets to haranguing, shifting in and out of two languages like gowns or genders to please have a little respect for the girls, flashing the one entrancing and unavoidable gap in the center of her upper teeth. And when the cellophane drop goes black, a new spot coronas her in a wig fit for the end of a century, and she tosses back her hair, risky gesture, and raises her arms like a widow in a blood tragedy, all will and black lace, and lip syncs you and me against the world. She's a man you wouldn't look twice at in street clothes. 200 pounds of hard living, the gap in her smile sadly narrative, but she's a monument in the mysterious permission of the dress. This is Esta Noche, a Latin drag bar in the Mission, its black door a gap in the face of a battered wall. All over the neighborhood, storefront windows show all night shrined hats and gloves, wedding dresses, first communions frothing lace, gowns of perfection and commencement, fixed promises glowing. In the dress the color of the spaces between street lamps, Lola stands unassailable, the dress in which she is in the largest sense fabulous, a lesson, a criticism and colossus of gender, all fire and irony, her spine's perfectly erect, only her fluid hands moving and her head turned slightly to one side. She hosts the pageant, Wednesdays and Saturdays, and men come in from the streets, the trains and the repair shops, lean together to rank the artifice of the awkward or lovely Lola welcomes onto her stage. Victoria, Elena, Francie, lame pumps and stockings, and always the rippling night pulled down over broad shoulders and flounced around the hips, liquid, the black silk of esta noche, proving that perfection and beauty are so alien they almost never touch. Tonight, she says, put it on. The costume is license and calling. She says you could wear the whole damn black sky and all its spangles. It's the only night we have to stand on. Put it on. It's the only thing we have to wear. I read that poem in a school in California not too long ago, and a young man came up afterwards and told me that Lola had come to his college and done a gender identity workshop. So I think like the Humanities Festival could keep this in mind, that Lola might be invited here to
Lola's available.
Lola's available. This is a little poem which wants to think about, we have this endlessly reiterated erotic dynamic of tops and bottoms, and everybody loves to insult the bottom, right? The bottom is powerless. The bottom is the butt of jokes. Men aren't supposed to want to be the bottom because it's being feminine or powerless to be the bottom, right? This is a poem that wants to celebrate the bottom. It's called The Boot Black. What can be said of this happiness? The boot black boy on his knees in the dim of the bar gives himself completely to the work of polishing, leaning into the body on the stool before him, a shirtless and eager man who's being mouthed clean. Around them parts the human dark. Not much to do with degradation. The generous boot black pours his attention out of his body, all alertness, into the presence before him, up the legs, beautiful, burying his face in the warm cloth of the lap, completed, receptacle, recipient, held, filled. Though it's hardly passive. He's working to relinquish, giving the seated one pleasure, releasing his own weight. They seem to light the gloom of their corner. Together they make one lamp. And as if his work were not complete until it had been seen by another, labor of the mouth, art perfected with the tongue, he turns his face up toward me, his witness, smiling, though the verbs thin for this unshielded triumph of a face. What's he conquered? Distance and dissatisfaction have slipped from the look he lifts to me, so that his power might not go unacknowledged, now that he is the image of achieved joy. And just one more little poem. This is we talked a good deal about the AIDS epidemic, and so this is just a brief poem. The Gift of a Dream. It's called The Embrace. You weren't well or really ill yet either, just a little tired, your handsomeness tinged by grief or anticipation, which brought to your face a thoughtful, deepening grace. I didn't for a moment doubt you were dead. I knew that to be true still, even in the dream. You'd been out, at work maybe, having a good day, almost energetic. We seemed to be moving from some old house where we'd lived, boxes everywhere, things in disarray. That was the story of my dream. But even asleep, I was shocked out of narrative by your face, the physical fact of your face, inches from mine, smooth-shaven, loving, alert. Why so difficult remembering the actual look of you without a photograph, without strain? So when I saw your unguarded, reliable face, your unmistakable gaze opening all the warmth and clarity of you, warm brown tea, we held each other for the time the dream allowed. Bless you. You came back so I could see you once more, plainly, so I could rest against you without thinking this happiness lessened anything, without thinking you were alive again.
The piece is called Kimberly. I have to be stopped, Kimberly said. Her breath blurred her words, transmitting a whooshing sound that made me push the phone away. Well, okay, maybe not have to, I say should, but that begs the question of why. I mean, who cares? So maybe what I really mean is, I need to be stopped. Are you listening to me? I really was. She was asking me to keep her from killing herself. There was no method chosen yet. It could have been slashing her wrists or lying down on the train tracks outside of town, or just blowing her brains out with a polymer pistol, say, a Glock 19, available at Walmart or at half price from the same cretin who sold her cocaine. Hello? I hear you, I finally said. Where are you? I left my VW Golf at home and took a cab to pick her up from some squalid blues bar, the only pale face in the place. The guy at the door, a black man old enough to have been an adolescent during the civil rights era, but raised with the polite deference of the previous generation, didn't hide his relief when I grabbed my tattooed friend, threw her in her car, and took her home with me. It was all I could think to do, and it made sense for both of us. Kimberly had been homeless, living out of her car, an antique Toyota Corolla that had had its lights punched out on too many occasions, and now traveled unsteadily with huge swatches of duct tape holding up its fender. In all honesty, I was a bit unsteady myself, afflicted with the kind of loneliness that's felt in the gut like a chronic and never fully realized nausea. Also, it was fall, a particularly gorgeous time in Indiana, with its spray of colors on every tree, but in our town, one with a seasonal peril for college-age girls. It seemed that about this time every year there would be a disappearance. Someone would fail to show at her dorm or study hall. This would be followed by a flowering of flyers and posts and bulletin boards featuring a girl with a simple smile and a reward. Because the girl was always white and pointedly ordinary, there would be a strange familiarity about her. Everyone was sure they'd seen her at the Commons or the bookstore, waiting for the campus bus, or at the Bluebird the previous weekend. It may seem perverse to say this, but every year we waited for that disappearance, not in shock or horror, or to look for new clues to apprehend the culprit. We waited in anticipation of relief. Once the psycho got his girl, he seemed pacified, so we listened with a little less urgency to the footsteps behind us in the parking lot, worried less went out running at dawn. Spared, we would look guiltily at those flyers, which would be faded and torn by spring, when a farmer readying his field for planting would discover the girl among the papery remains of the previous year's harvest. When Kimberly moved in with me in November, the annual kill had not yet occurred, and I was worried for both of us. Her in her car and me in my first-floor one-bedroom, the window open for my cat, Brian Eno, to come and go as she pleased. I had trapped it so it couldn't be opened more than a few inches, but that meant it was never closed all the way, even in the worst of winter. In my mind, Kimberly and I reeked of prey. We were both boyish girls, pink and sad. She wore straight blonde hair that moved in concert and had features angled to throw artful shadows. Mine, by contrast, were soft and vaguely tropical, overwhelmed by a carnival of curls. We both seemed to be in weakened states. Her girlfriend had caught her in fragante delito and walked out, Depression had swallowed her in the aftermath. She couldn't concentrate at her restaurant job, mixing up simple orders, barking at the customers, so that it wasn't long before she found herself at the unemployment office, where her insistence on stepping out to smoke cost her in line so many times she finally gave up. It quickly followed that she went home one rosy dawn and discovered that her landlord, aware that he had no right to do so, but convinced that Kimberly, now 4 months late on her rent, would never get it together to legally contest it, had stacked all of her belongings on the sidewalk, where they had been picked over by the students at International House. All that was left were a few T-shirts from various political marches, mostly black, books from her old and useless major in Marxist theory, and to our surprise, her battered iBook. The screen was cracked, though it worked fine. Me? I'd just broken up with my boyfriend. It was my doing. It just felt like we were going nowhere. But I was past the point of righteousness and heavily into doubt. Not about my decision, that I never questioned, but about whether I'd ever care enough to understand another human being, whether I'd ever figure out how to stay after the initial flush, or whether I'd ever get over my absurd sense of self-sufficiency. When I brought Kimberly to live with me, she hadn't replaced much of anything, and we emptied the Toyota in one trip. I gave her my futon to sleep on in the living room, surrendered a drawer in the dresser, pushed my clothes to one side of the closet, and explained my alphabetized CDs, my work hours at a smokehouse one town over, and that we'd never starve for meat, and my books. Since Kimberly had never visited me after I moved out of my parents' house, in truth we were more acquaintances than friends, I was especially emphatic about the books, prized possessions I'd been collecting since I had first earned a paycheck. I pointed out the shelf of first editions, among them Richard Wright's Native Son, Sapphire's American Dreams, Virginia Woolf's Orlando, a rare copy of The Cook and the Carpenter, and Langston Hughes and Ben Carruthers' limited edition translations of Nicolas Guillen's Cuba Libre, all encased in saran wrap. There were also a handful of 19th century travel books on Cuba, fascinating for their racist assumptions, and a few autograph volumes, including novels by Dennis Cooper, Ana Maria Shua, and Monique Wittig. These never leave the shelf. They never get unwrapped, I said. If you want to read one of them, tell me and I'll get you a copy, or I'll make a Xerox. Cool, she said in a disinterested whisper, pulling off her boots, long, sleek things that suggested she should be carrying a riding crop. She leaned back on the futon in exhaustion and put her hands behind her head. There was an elegant and casual muscularity to her tattooed limbs, a pliability that I would later come to know under entirely different circumstances. Kimberly had not been installed in my apartment more than a day or two, crying and sniffling, refusing to eat with the usual determination of the newly heartbroken, when I noticed that Native Son was gone, leaving a gaping hole on my shelf. I assumed that she'd taken it down to read in whatever second I had turned my back. I trotted over to the futon and picked around and under the pillow. The sheets were neatly folded, the blanket too. Had anyone else been in the apartment except us two? No, not a soul. Not even Brian Eno, who'd been out hunting. I contemplated my dilemma. How to ask a potential suicide if they're ripping you off. Sometime the next day, after a restless night of weeping and pillow punching, which I could hear in the bedroom, even with the door closed, Kimberly managed to shower and put on a fresh black tea, then lumbered into the kitchen. She barely nodded. It seemed that if she'd actually completed the gesture, her head might have been in danger of rolling off. I suppose I should have been worried, given the threat of suicide so boldly announced, about Kimberly's whereabouts when she wasn't home. But I wasn't. I wasn't worried at all. I didn't throw out my razors. I didn't hide the belts. I didn't turn off the pilot in the oven. It's not that I didn't think she was at risk, because I did. I absolutely did. It's just that when she told me she needed to be stopped, I took it to mean she needed me to shelter her until she recovered, which I assumed would be soon. I thought, in fact, that I'd pretty much done my duty as a friend by bringing her home and feeding her a cherry-smoked ham sandwich. Truth is, I was much more focused on the maniac whose quarry was still bounding out there in the wilderness. I would pull out the local print-only newspaper every day when I got to the smokehouse and make for the police blotter. I knew, of course, that once the villain committed to the deed, it'd be front-page news, but I held out hope for clues from anticipatory crimes. Once, there was an incident on a hiking trail. 2 girls were approached by a white man in his 50s, sallow and scurvy, who tried to grab one of them. The other girl turned out to be a member of the campus taekwondo team and rapid-kicked his face before he somehow managed to get away. For several days after that, I was on the lookout for any man in his 50s who might come into the smokehouse looking like tenderized meat. and I avoided all trails, even the carefully landscaped routes between campus buildings. Because the smokehouse was isolated in order to realize its function, and its clientele fairly specialized, we sold gourmet meat, including bison, ostrich, and alligator, mostly by phone and online, though our best seller was summer sausage, as common in central Indiana as Oscar Mayer. There wasn't much foot traffic in and out of the store, and I actually spent a great deal of time alone. After I'd processed the orders, packed the UPS boxes, replenished and rearranged the display cases, made coffee and added some chips to the smoker, there wasn't much for me to do but sit there, trying to study while avoiding giving too much importance to the noises outside that suggested furtive steps in the yard or shadows that looked like bodies meant to hide below the windowsill, just waiting for me to lift the frame and expose my neck for strangulation. One evening, I came home to find Kimberly with my santuco knife in hand, little pyramids of chopped onions, green pepper, and slimy octopus arms with their puckering cups arranged on the counter. Brian Eno reached up from the floor, her calico belly and paws extended toward the heaven promised above. "Dinner," Kimberly announced as soon as I stepped in, lighting a flame under the wok. I kicked my boots off, stripped my scarf from around my neck, and let my coat slide from my body, all along yakking about the psychopath and his apparent disinterest this year. "Maybe he finally died," offered Kimberly. "Yeah, that's what I thought when we were about 15, because it took until January that year, remember? But then I realized it's got to be more than one guy," I said. "You think he's got accomplices?" Kimberly asked, a tendril of smoke rising from the wok. "Or copycats," I said. "I'm into the copycat theory." That's about when I noticed Sapphire angling in unfamiliar fashion on the bookshelf. Wolf's Orlando was no longer beside it. Had I considered what my reaction would have been any other time, I might have said rage. But seeing the jaunty leaning that suddenly gave the shelves a deliberately decorated look, I felt like I'd been hit in the stomach. I was still catching my breath when I turned around and saw Kimberly. The santuco had left her right hand, embedding its blade upright in the knuckles of the left. Blood seeped sparingly from between her fingers, but collected quickly around the octopus pile, which now looked wounded and alive. I took Kimberly to the county hospital, where they stitched the flaps of skin back together. Her hand, now bright and swollen like an apostomatic amphibian, rested on the dashboard all the way home. We drove back in silence, her eyes closed, head inclined and threatening to hit the windshield. In the kitchen, the onion and green pepper pyramids were intact on the counter, but the octopus had vanished. Smudged paw tracks led out Brian Eno's usual route through the living room window. Kimberly stood unsteadily under the light, her face shadowed. I sat down on the futon. "What happened to Native Son? To Orlando?" I asked. She shrugged. "Did you take them?" She spun, slowly, on the heel of her boot, dragging her other foot around in a circle. "Kimberly, I hurt," she said. "I really hurt." Her skin was a bluish red as she threw herself on my lap and bawled. A week later, Native Son and Orlando were still missing, but Kimberly and I hadn't been able to talk about it. Our schedules failed to coincide, and my mother, widowed and alone on the other side of town, had gone to visit relatives in Miami, leaving me to deal with her cat, Brian Eno's brother, a daring aerialist she'd named Alfredo Codona, after the Mexican trapeze artist who'd killed himself and his ex-wife. This complicated my life a bit more than usual, and I found myself drained after dealing with the temporarily housebound Alfredo, whose pent-up frustrations tended to result in toppled chairs, broken picture frames, and a scattering of magazines and knickknacks. One time, I was so tired when I got home, I headed straight for the tub and finished undressing as the hot water nipped at my knees. I adjusted the temperature, then let myself go under, blowing out my breath in fat, noisy bubbles. I came back up and didn't bother to lift my lids. I used my toes to turn off the faucet, then went into a semi-somnambulous state in which neither my mother nor Alfredo Codona could engage me. Native Son and Orlando were back where they belong, and Kimberly was laughing. What? I sat up, water splashing on the floor and on my clothes. I heard the refrigerator pop open, then tenebrous voices. I pulled the plug and gathered a towel around me, but when I opened the door, I was startled by the blurry blackness of the living room. I heard rustling from the futon, conspiratorial giggling, and Brian Eno's anxious meowing outside the unexpectedly closed window. To my amazement, Kimberly had brought somebody home. I didn't especially like the idea of her having sex in my living room, but we hadn't talked about it. I'd assumed, since she was supposedly suicidal, that there wasn't a need for that talk. Now I was trapped, naked and wet, watching Kimberly hovering above her lover, as agile as the real Alfredo Cardona on the high wire. Outside, Brian Eno wailed, tapping her paws on the glass. I shrugged as if she could understand, but all she did was unleash an even more high-pitched scream. It was raining outside. I held tight to the towel and started across the room as quietly as I could. But as I tried to open the window, I felt a hand on my ankle. Its warmth rose up my leg, infused my gut, and became a knot in my throat. I looked down and saw Kimberly's arm, its jagged tattoos pulsing. Rather than jerk away, I bent to undo her fingers, only to find myself face to face with her. Her lips were glistening, and below her chin was a milky slope with a puckered nipple. She moved to make room for me, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I don't know how or why, but my mouth opened to the stranger's breast, tasting her in the vague tobacco of Kimberly's spit. Afterwards, as Kimberly and I sprawled on either side of the girl, I recognized her as a clerk from a bookstore in town. She seemed dazed and pleased, her shoulder up against Kimberly as she stroked my belly. I realized that for the last hour or so, as engaged as we'd been in this most intimate of maneuvers, Kimberly and I had not kissed or otherwise touched. We had worked side by side, a haloid membrane, structureless and free. "Here, Banana Boat Queen," Kimberly said with a sly grin as she passed me a joint. Banana Boat Queen? And I thought, where the fuck did she get that? How the hell did she think she'd earned dispensation for that? The girl between us bristled. Then Kimberly laughed. "Don't worry," she said to our guest. "I can do that." She and I go way back. In all honesty, I don't know when I met Kimberly. It seemed she had always been there from the very day we arrived from Cuba. Hers was a mysterious and solitary world. I realized that one winter day in my junior year as I was walking home from school just as dusk was settling in. Kimberly pulled her Toyota next to me and asked if I wanted a ride. As soon as I got in, she offered me a cigarette. I said no. A disgusting habit. Anyway, you want to see something? What? Without another word, Kimberly aimed the Toyota out of town, past the last deadbeat bar, the strip malls and the trailer parks, past the ramp to the interstate, until she entered a narrow gravel road with corn blossoming on either side. There was a brackish smell, the tang of wet dirt and nicotine. The Toyota danced on the gravel, but Kimberly, bent over the wheel, maintained a determined expression. "Are you ready?" "Ready? For what?" I asked, my fingers clutching the shoulder belt. "This," she whispered. Then she turned off the headlights. Before I had a chance to adjust to the tracers, she gunned the car, hurling it down the black tunnel, the tires spitting rocks as she swirled this way and that, following the eerie spotlight provided by the moon. For a moment, we were suspended in air and time. My life did not pass in front of my eyes how I might have expected. Instead, I saw images of desperate people on a bounding sea, multitudes wandering Fifth Avenue or the Thames, the shores of the Bosporus or the sands outside the pyramids, mirrors and mirrors, mercury and water, a family portrait in Havana from years before, my mother with her tangled hair, my father tilting his hat in New Orleans or Galveston, the shadows of birds of paradise against a stucco wall, a shallow and watery grave, then another longer passage, a trail of bones. Just then the silver edged the sharp edges of the corn stalks, teasing them to life as specters in black coats. "We're going to die," I screamed. Moments later, the Toyota came to a shaky stop as we both gasped for breath. A cloud of smoke surrounded us, reeking of fermentation and gasoline. I popped open the door and crawled outside, where I promptly threw up. Kimberly scrambled over the seat and out, practically on top of me. Her arms held me steady. "You okay?" she asked, panting. "That was amazing," I said, my heart still racing. "Just amazing." Do I stop or go on?
Where are we?
13.
Where are we on time?
6 more.
6 more. Where are we on time? We good? Very good.
Go on?
Keep going.
Not even a week had gone by when Kimberly brought another girl home. This time an Eastern European professor who'd been implicated with a Cuban during a semester abroad in Bucharest. Rather than wait for me to stumble onto them, they had marched right into my bedroom, naked as newborns. I was going to protest, but was too unnerved by their boldness, and then in my weakness, seduced by the silky warmth of skin on either side of me. Seconds later, I felt something hard and cold against my belly, and looked down to see Kimberly wearing a harness with a summer sausage protruding from it.
Yeah, go on.
The professor sighed as I guided the meat. As she licked and bit at my chin, Kimberly pushed inch by pseudophilic inch into her. At one point, Kimberly was balanced above me, her mouth grazing mine, but we just stared past each other. Afterwards, the professor between us, we luxuriated, the room redolent of garlic, pepper, and sweat. Quite the little Cuban sandwich we've got here, Kimberly said, passing me what now seemed like the obligatory after-sex joint, followed by the vaguely racist comment. The professor stiffened. Like the bookstore girl, she turned her back to Kimberly. Instead of rubbing my belly, this one settled her head on my shoulder, then fell happily asleep. Kimberly, you've got to stop, I said. I hesitated. I've got to get my books back. Do you understand? Her head was buried under the pillow on the futon, the early morning light shiny on her exposed shoulder blade. With the white sheet crumbled halfway up her back, she looked like a headless angel. Kimberly, are you listening to me? There was some imperceptible movement, a twitch. Would you please? I'm talking to you. She emerged, curtain of yellow hair, eyes smoky. What makes you think I took them? What? Are you kidding me? Could have been the bookstore girl, or the professor. Since the menage, the bookstore girl had called to invite me to dinner, but I had declined, and the professor had stopped by twice, once with the first edition of Upton Sinclair's Mental Radio. Tempting, achingly tempting, as that 1930 oddity was, I had refused it. I'll let Kimberly know you stopped by, I had added, biting my lip. I didn't come to see Kimberly, the professor had said, her fingers pulling on my curls, which I'd found disconcerting. Kimberly was looking at me now, waiting for an answer. My books were missing before the bookstore girl and the professor, I said. Oh, we've got to talk about that, too. Down went her head. Now? She asked, her voice distant and flimsy like a final communication from a sinking ship. Now. She hopped up, her hip bones pure cartilage. She shivered. I'll be right back, she said, headed for the bathroom. I dropped on the futon, heard her pee into the bowl, then the water running. I scanned the shelf, imagining where mental radio might have fit. Silence. Then,
Questions? Do you want to open it up to everybody?
I can stop there if you want.
Keep going. Okay, it's up to you. Do you want to ask questions of our writers, or we can keep going?
No, we can stop. We can stop.
Sure.
Yeah. You'll just have to imagine that other section.
It's going to be published, isn't it? I felt like silence was a good time to stop, because it's like building.
It's all right. We're
Is
good.
it going to be published soon?
Probably next year.
Next year. We have about 5 minutes, and so what I wanted to do was just open it up to anyone who had questions for our writers. So if you could just like to come up, and I think we can probably do
Thanks
that.
so much for being here. I wanted to ask you, because both of you have mentioned specific pieces of literature very explicitly, both in conversation and actually in your piece. And I was curious if maybe you see some sort of connection in terms of like a literary tradition that particularly LGBTQ queer writers use books and specific texts to sort of construct a lineage for themselves. Can you speak to that?
One of the dominant models for thinking about literary influence in our time is Harold Bloom and the anxiety of influence. So this notion that writers are always trying to overcome the past, and that basically what we want to do is sort of kill off our ancestors and hide the bodies somewhere. And it seems to me that gay and lesbian writers are quite the opposite, want to position our ancestors in the text and claim them. So you think about this tradition of looking for permission-giving figures. Adrienne Rich adopting Muriel Rukeyser as a kind of patron. James Merrill and Auden. Again and again, the gay and lesbian writer cleaves to a family of choice and speaks to them, invokes them, welcomes their presence onto the page. I love that.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think in part that has to do with the fact that so very few of us are born into gay families. And so this is how we sort of create our personal history as much as our, more public history. And that it's really important to say we come from this tradition, we share with these people these things in common.
It's also probably related to our earlier conversation too about teaching, that these are people that, if we were taught to read them, we weren't taught to read them accurately.
Right.
Right? And I think that we understand that when we turn to Elizabeth Bishop or to Hart Crane or to Walt Whitman, we can find something else because of our position as readers, and that something else is a gift.
Connected to that, when I read in '65 James Baldwin's Another Country, it was a salvation, and I had to think that I've been in Germany since 1971 and wrote gay songs in German, so my parents, my father's side of the family would never know. They knew I was gay, but that was the promise, and it split me through 2 continents. This, I will say my question, actually I'm going to sing my question. This is the question that came to me, and it goes like this. It just came to me. Querying the words that I've heard are the times memory gets hypnotized.
I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off there, but if you could ask the question, because we have so many people that want to early have a question.
Friend and neighbor, this is gay.
I agree.
I'll say the end of it. It's the first time in my life that I was ever stopped, but that's...
I apologize.
Memories get hypnotized when longing freezes the memory so that it just keeps repeating. And the repetition is when recreating a past when one does not belong because one was gay and excluded. Okay.
So that question? Okay, thank you.
But it was a question. Does that ever happen?
Oh,
In writing, it's a real question that writing becomes mechanically hypnotized in trying to undo a past that was not accepted.
Well, it seems like your question speaks to the nature of obsession. And of course, writers return to the ground of the obsessive territory, and we return to our wounds. We return to the places that we've been harmed in an attempt to redress them and an attempt to make use of them.
But I think it's more a personal thing rather than a historical thing. I think it's not so much that we're thinking in these large historical terms, but rather that we're responding to personal obsessions and personal issues that, whether they fit in or not, becomes completely secondary to the deal.
Which probably turn out to be part of history, but
Exactly.
But who cares?
But who cares?
There are
Yeah.
obsessions.
There are obsessions, and that's what's important.
Get to history later.
Screw history.
we have a young woman on this side.
Oh,
We have a young woman
hi.
on this
Whoops.
side. She's been waiting a minute.
Hi. When I read the source, I definitely saw some transcendentalist themes. And I wanted to ask, this would be an assumption, but how does spirituality affect your life and your work?
Well, the book that the questioner is referring to, Source, is a book that is saturated in Walt Whitman in lots of ways. And Whitman, of course, loved Emerson. When Whitman, about 1840, before he'd ever even written a poem, Whitman heard Emerson speak in New York City, and Emerson was giving an early version of a talk that later became his essay, The Poet. And that's an essay about how come we don't have a great poet speaking of American life? Where is that bard? And Walt Whitman must have heard that and said, right, I'm going to do that right here, right here. I'm on the way. And it's maybe a dozen years later, maybe a little less than that he publishes the first edition of Leaves of Grass. And both of those thinkers believed that you could get the education you needed by paying attention to the world. That if you walked out there towards that lake and you looked long enough and you listened hard enough, you would be instructed. And so there's a kind of, I want to say a kind of, I don't want to use the word native exactly, but there's like an American spiritual principle at work there. That maybe we don't as a group want to follow leaders and teachers so much as we want to find our own instruction. We want to seek out our own spiritual path. And I think Emerson and Whitman were prophets of that. So that's been really important to me. As a poet, I don't much believe in following the path that spiritual teachers have laid down, but I'm very interested in trying to figure it out. Poetry is sometimes an act of forming philosophy, studying the parts of one's own experience and trying to find your way towards meaning. Does that answer your question?
And I wonder if the same question, I actually have not read any of your work, but if it applies to you too. And I'm actually from Michigan City, so I thought that was funny.
Oh my God. Yeah, my work, in terms of spirituality, I mean, it's always sort of there in some way. I am not a very religious person at all, but I come from a lot of different religious traditions. My dad was Jewish, my mom was Catholic, but Cuban Catholic, which means she had a lot of glasses of water under the bed, and did things with goats. So I mean, that sort of stuff always plays with me. And I think in the Caribbean is a place of tremendous, sort of magic and mystery. So I think that always sort of plays in some way. I think probably more in the last novel, Days of Awe, than anything else, because I was very deliberately working with some, themes of spirituality, and in some of the poetry. But I think it's always sort of present in some way. I don't know. For me, the whole spirituality thing has a lot more to do with my being Cuban than it has to do with being queer. I had a girlfriend who identified as a Wicca and all that, and I went through that, and it's part of that toll booth period, and that was great. But I'm back to the goats.
Blessed be.
Blessed be.
Blessed be.
Thank you.
And sometimes traditions get passed down, and we don't necessarily know where the traditions are coming from, and yet they have context passing down from a spiritual practice, but was passed down as tradition or
As
custom,
right.
and not as a spiritual practice.
Yeah, it's also very typical of the Caribbean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cece, I'm sorry, with the library closing, we need to bring this one up.
Okay. Do you want to just ask your question, and then maybe we can?
Yeah, just one more, and then we'll go out there and do what we need to do.
Okay.
Short question.
Yeah.
Short question. Okay.
So both of your writing is really sexy. And I was wondering, when you're trying to put those experiences of desire and sexuality into words, that must be hard to write about, not just because it's taboo, but because it seems like you're approaching almost the ineffable. I'm thinking of how homo will not inherit. So what's your experience like in trying to put that into a form, and is there pleasure in recounting those experiences? If you could just quickly speak to that.
I'll take this one.
One line.
The writer setting out to talk about sex is surrounded by deep, deep pitfalls. One of them, of course, is clinical speech. So you start to use terms that you wouldn't use in conversation, and it sounds like medical description. On the other end is pornography, right, which can be perfectly hot but may not be satisfying as something to return to. It doesn't tend to work as literature. And then there's euphemism, right, where everything's turned into geography. And so these three areas are problems. And being able to talk about sex while controlling your tone and diction is one of the hardest challenges that I think that any writer faces. So there's also the one other piece that I want to mention quickly is that when we talk about sex, we're really talking about something else. Like in this story, this beautiful story, that sex is so much about the complicated relationship between those two people, and the narrator and Kimberly's relationship isn't sexy.
At all.
It's the other third that's sexy, right? And in the poem that I read you about the boot black, that's really so much wanting to think about power and submission more than it is about actual horniness. So it seems like this is always happening when we write about sex, that we go somewhere else.
I want to touch on one thing you said, though. You said something about it always being so taboo or something to that extent. The truth of the matter is, I never think about it being taboo. I think if I thought about it being taboo, it would then become an incredibly paralyzing thing. I have to think, and I do think, that it's a pretty natural thing. And in the history of literature in the Caribbean, it's not taboo. sex is pretty up and out there. You know, I don't know if you guys remember when Buena Vista came out, one of the older fellows who was one of the, Compay Segundo was in his 90s, and Chan Chan became this big, big hit in the United States. And I remember a copy editor at the Tribune came up to me one day and said, "Oh my God, I just found out what the words to that song were. I couldn't believe it. That guy's 90-something. That means he wrote that thing like, you know, in the 20s. And I was like, duh. I mean, you know, play on words, the whole sexy thing. I mean, it's just a part of the culture. And, you know, there's this confusion about Latin America and being Catholic and all this crap. That falls apart in the Caribbean because we have such a strong influence from so many other cultures, you know, and the Caribbean is this fantastic mix. And one of the things that happens is that sexuality comes to the fore. So for me, it is not an issue about being taboo. And frankly, I have a bad reaction when people talk about how they're breaking taboos. I mean, if you're really thinking about it that much, you're not having any fun.
And with that, we will close. Thank you so much, Chicago Humanities Festival. We want to thank Center on Halsted for co-sponsoring the event. And we want to thank the Harold Washington Library for having us. And thank you, Mark Doty and Achy Obejas. Thank you so much. And there's books right outside.
Thank you.